Hello and welcome to this episode of our program Money Means Business. I'm Mona Moselhi, sitting here on behalf of my colleague Nermeen Nazim, and today we'll be having a kind of recap to the Egyptian economy in 2016, a recap to how the Egyptian economy has progressed throughout the year. Now, Egypt has made progress in restoring confidence in several areas. Recent policy choices include measures designed to introduce more dynamic investment and spur much needed private sector job creation. The reform of fuel subsidies has been also a notable achievement. Egypt has also signed a staff level agreement with the IMF over a 3-year loan with 12 billion US dollars. The parliament is largely supportive of the policies introduced by the government. Also, we'll be tackling many of the mega projects that have been launched or have been implemented or kind of carried out with or as planned or as scheduled. We'll be also introducing a number of measures that have been carried out by the government. The government has embarked on an economic plan in order to put the Egyptian economy on track. We'll be discussing all this and more in our episode tonight. Let me welcome our guests, Mr. Hussein Raouf, ex-head of the International Bank. Thank you very much for being with us. And Mr. Angus Blair, International Investment Banker. Thank you very much for being with us, sir.
Thank you.
Before we delve into our discussion, first let's have a very brief break and we'll come back into discussion.
Egypt has uniquely undergone 2 revolutions in less than 3 years for better living and the rule of democracy. Egypt remains, after all, as an attractive investment destination despite the difficulties it faced. Ahead of the 2011 revolution, the Egyptian economy was performing well, as confirmed by all KPIs.
We feel very confident about the Egyptian market. The main factors or the main pillars of the Egyptian economy are still here, and they're not going anywhere.
Egypt is a good place to invest, first of all, because it's a big market. It's a big local market. It's a good geographical location. You have good people, and the costs are competitive. So it's a great place. It was, it is, and it will be a great place to invest.
Right, welcome back and to our discussion. And let me first start with many of the measures that have been taken by the government in order to put the country on track. Some of these measures were very much favorable and others were not favorable to the Egyptian streets. But let's speak about the program at large. How can we describe measures that have been taken by the government recently in order to carry out with its reforms?
I think the flotation of the Egyptian pound is a great step. It's a great step for the future of Egypt. I think depressing the US dollar pound rate for so long has created unfavorable conditions for all our exporters. At the same time, we're subsidizing other countries' exports to us. So I think it was a big mistake subsidizing the US dollar rate since 2009. It was before the revolution by 2 years, actually. The rally of the US dollar pound started in 2009, not in 2010 and 11 as people believe. So I think now we are in the right track. And I think we are near the top. I mean, there are several measures. I'm sorry to focus on this because I know this is the main issue that is being discussed in the newspaper.
It is affecting many sectors.
And it's affecting. I think we are very near to the top. I think there are two ways to calculate the dollar-Egyptian pound rate. One is by taking the inflation rate between two countries, which is the US and Egypt. And since 2005, if we take this way of calculating the US dollar-Egyptian pound rate, the rate will be around 12. If you take the inflation rate differential and then add it to the base rate of 2008 when the pound was really stable. There is another measure which is a purchasing power parity. The purchasing power parity, the pound is overvalued by 300%. So if you take the 7.5 to 8 pounds foreign exchange rate, we are very near to the band, to the higher band, which is around 22. So we are very near there. I think we have reached the top, and I think the pound will improve during the next 2 or 3 months.
But that also reflected on investments and investors, particularly those who, the traders. How, from your point of view as a banker, did this reflect on the operations, purchases and exports and imports and, yes?
Yeah, well, you've got to put it in perspective. There have been a number of years of uncertainty and general economic instability. But the positive news is that there was, apart from one quarter, since January 2011, there's only been one quarter where economic growth was below zero. So economic growth has been stronger than anyone would have assumed, given the background. And I think much of that helped, first of all, by very low household and very low private sector debts. In a world that's full of debt, that is a huge strength for the Egyptian economy. Although government debt is rising quite quickly, and that's more of a concern. But private sector debt and household sector debt at incredibly low levels, plus a very large informal economy, has kept the economy moving. But there are a number of other stresses, as my colleague here, Rove, has been mentioning. There have been accumulated stresses in a variety of areas. Inflation has always been a problem. In the over 25 years I've looked at Egypt, outside Egypt, and in it, has been far too high, well beyond global norms. That really has to be looked at. Maybe we can discuss it in the programme by improving the internal market. That's been an issue that needs to be addressed. But the key, and you've mentioned the currency, we need to get more stability and to increase investment. First of all, the most important element of this is domestic investment, then global investment, because they'll come in after. So I think the first thing we need to do is improve domestic sentiment. There's been a partial resetting in the economy by the devaluation and then the free float of the currency. And the free float of the currency came as a big surprise. All of the investment banks had assumed a managed float, and it's a free float. But that's quite a tough policy to maintain, and it comes with other risks, but they're manageable risks. So what we need to do still is we need a new investment law. The market's still waiting. We're waiting for other issues, the bankruptcy law and other issues, to be able to encourage domestic investors and speed up all of the decision making, because it's still quite problematic the time it takes to fulfill all of the paperwork to set up companies compared to now other countries. And then finally, to help global investors come in and prove that it's an attractive market. It is an attractive market, but it's not attractive compared to many other markets where it's much easier to invest, where the law is simpler, where there's, of course, they're able to remit profits. All of these issues still have to be addressed. And of course, Egypt needs to improve its foreign currency earnings. And the main earner, the Suez Canal revenues are rather flat, but tourism revenues. We've got this winter the beginnings at last of an upturn, with Luxor looking to be fully sold out, Cairo busy, and Aswan, I think, busier. So perhaps now we've got the beginning of an upswing in tourism, so foreign exchange revenues can rise, and that will help. But it's partial elements in a bigger program. And one thing, before we finish, we need a real reform, economic reform package. We've only had a part of that with the cutting of the fuel subsidy and the flotation of the pound. There needs to be a real privatization program. We're expecting that in 2017, which will be very good. But instead of selling, say, a small stake in a bank, I think learn from the lesson of one of the banks that we privatized. I did it in '96. It's been a huge success. It became the biggest private sector bank in Egypt. I know we're not allowed to mention the names, but it helps the market. If you sell more of, privatize more of the company, in fact, if you could sell all of it, you get much more interest from outside. It would bring you money in.
I guess the privatization program has to be very much addressed, but this should be referred to, I guess, authorities rather than we discussing that.
Well, we have to do it in the end, because it comes through the marketplace.
Well, of course, 2017 is open to everything, so I guess today would be one of those recommendations, so why not? You spoke about manageable risks, right? Manageable risks in terms of what? And I mean here, we're speaking about investors. We're speaking about the control of prices for the common citizens. We're speaking about huge projects, and we're speaking about small and medium enterprises, plus, of course, the micro ones that have already been supposedly, we were speaking about trying to help them small and medium enterprises, plus the micro ones. From your point of view, how did the liberalization of the currency, or did it help this segment of the investors? How did it? And what is the reflection of the liberalization of the currency on the other segment, which is the very Egyptian, the very common Egyptian?
I'll just mention one example. I had a phone call from one of my ex-customers. He exported equivalent of 2 million pounds. It's a small amount in 2015. During the last 2 months, he exported 77 million pounds. This is just one simple example of how the liberalization of the Egyptian pound has helped the economy.
Yes.
The economy in Egypt was dependent on imports. Most of the bank staff are working on the import department, the LC import department.
Exactly.
And so the whole infrastructure of the financial sector was built on how to finance imports. So it is affecting, of course, the banks. It's affecting the trade companies that are importing goods from. But this is not good for our economy. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, when you fix the exchange rate at a higher rate, you are subsidizing another country, basically. You are subsidizing the countries who are exporting to Egypt. So I mean, of course, the other argument is if you let it float, then the prices will go up. The Egyptian government basically issues since the 60s, the Egyptian government is doing things that is not being done anywhere else in the world. We are subsidizing food, subsidizing fuel. We have 23 million students in schools. We have 3 million students in universities and institutes similar to universities, which is 26 million being paid. If you take the private universities, the biggest private university in Egypt, just to give you an equivalent, it is 6,800 students. So you have 3 million total, out of which 6,800 only in the biggest private university in Egypt. So the government is actually taking too much on itself. And this program has been done in the 60s, since 1965, when the first economic plan really failed. And I think it's time that the government will let go of the subsidies. The government has to reduce expenditure. This will help the pound. This will be the main factors that will help the pound stabilize and will lower inflation, definitely.
As a matter of fact, the example that you've given was for exporters, and I guess that would encourage exporters, or rather exports, to grow.
Of course, of course. I mean, if I was in the shoes of the central bank, I would let the pound stabilize actually at these levels. I wouldn't encourage, you know, when conditions improves a little bit, I wouldn't encourage the pound to go much lower because it will hurt our exports. I mean, the inflation that was caused by this devaluation is done, absorbed by the economy. And if the pound stays stable at these levels, khalas, it is just one of thing that happened already. So by lowering the pound, actually we are exposing the local economy in the future to have another shock, because maybe in the future we'll have similar negative conditions due to this, terrorism or due to tourism or whatever, and then the pound will be devalued again. So it is better to let it at these levels. The price shock is done, absorbed, and it's finished. I want to mention something you mentioned about the mega projects. For example, there was a lot of criticism to the Suez Canal project that it is...
But before delving into the Suez Canal and the mega project, because yes, definitely this is one important segment that happened and took place during 2016. We'll go to that. But just to wrap up this part of our discussion, and let me here ask you, sir, you've also mentioned if the law is simpler. And we all know that there has been an investment law that was finally amended and sent to the Parliament for ratification, and that many of the items were not very much before the amendments were not satisfying to the investors. All these were important in this economic the economic reform program the government has put. From your point of view, what were the most important points that investors are seeking in an investment law, and that you saw that they would really reflect on investments?
Again, with respect, you can't just focus on one law, because when you're an investor coming from outside, there are multiple factors. So if you just take one element out of an investment law, when there are multiple factors in the decision-making of investing in Egypt, it might be a misstep to think just look at one thing. If you look at new markets, there's a global market for everything now, including alternative energy. Last summer, around $4 to $6 billion of foreign investment was going to come into Egypt in alternative energy. In the end, it didn't come in because the decision was taken on a specific element that they didn't agree with. Egypt's got to become much more competitive beyond the investment law. It's taken a very long time to get to the stage of an investment law. But Egypt doesn't actually have much time, because you've got the population growth 20 years ago was 1.2% per annum. It's now 2.6% per annum. You need to create about 2 million new jobs a year. So you've got to get economic growth up from about 4%, probably to double figures for a few years. That is doable because you have very low household and private sector debt. But you've got to be more than just an investment law where you have a speeding up of decision-making, a one-stop shop. Look at issues of arbitration, particularly, especially for foreign investors, is incredibly important. Look at the commercial law too, because it's a very slow law here. Other countries have done much, much more in a much, much shorter space of time. And I think...
What by a simpler law?
Well, the simplification of many laws, so that when you come in to a country, and I have to say I come from a country where the commercial laws are immensely complex too, and taxation. They're much more complex than they were before. So I'm not saying make everything simple, because you've got to look at a whole variety of issues when you set up all of the laws. But I think, first of all, is to make it easy to invest. That's what I meant. Make it easier. Because at the moment, it really...
What would make it easy to the investor?
Speed. First of all, the speed of decision-making. Because sometimes it takes a long time here, if you want to come in as a foreign investor. And some people...
You mean your procedures, huh?
I just gave you an example of between $4 and $6 billion was going to come into solar power projects and alternative and wind power projects that walked away, much of it. Now, there's a new round. Egypt can't afford to make mistakes like that. That's an enormous amount of money that would have come in as real investment into the marketplace. And some of that's been lost for good, because the whole world is moving into alternative energy, no matter what happens to the oil price. So I think what we need to do is to say Egypt really is open for business. And it's multiple factors that have to be looked at in Egypt. Perhaps too much for this program to be going into. But it isn't just the investment law. It's about the quality of life issues. If you're a foreign company, if you want to set up a regional presence, do you want to be in Egypt or Dubai or Beirut or whatever it would be? Egypt competes on a regional level and on a global level. And first of all, it's got to be much more competitive. On a cost basis, as Raouf has been mentioning, it's now become much more competitive. And it means that companies that maybe would look at Egypt would think, okay, this is interesting, what can I have? Can I have now a 24-hour energy supply? Now, yes. The President made a major push after 2014 for electricity generation, which was good. But it's more than that. Is the tax regime interesting? Actually, I'd say I would like to see the tax rate cut to attract domestic and global investment still further. Because even, my country in the UK want to bring it down from to below 20%. I would suggest bring it down to 18%, because then people would stop avoiding tax. You would say this is highly competitive. Yeah. I would make areas, and this doesn't go down well with some of my friends I've met in Parliament, but I would make special zones, tax-free zones, to attract investment. I would have fiscal incentives for specific industries for a period to attract investment, as they do all over Europe. There are lessons to be learned for what happens in, say, the Scottish Development Agency or different agencies across Europe to attract investment in specific areas. So it's multiple levels of things that need to be addressed, but done quickly.
Tax-free zones.
Yes, I'd love to see that, because at the moment, I think...
You mean here special zones?
I think the market had assumed that the Suez Canal zone was going to be a tax-free zone,
exactly,
and it's not. It's the same tax rate. So it's going to be more difficult to attract when you have a free zone in Jebel Ali in Dubai, a free zone in Talal in Oman, a free zone in Tangier. So I think that, and I have to say it's been managed well. I think Mr. Darwish is doing a super job there. But I think they need to do more to attract people to come in, because people don't have to be in Egypt. They can be in Morocco or Saudi Arabia, or in Nigeria or Kenya or Poland. And Egypt, I think, has to realise it has to do much more to be much more competitive. And realising it's a bit like I heard the argument, someone saying that after the devaluation and the free float, we've done enough now, foreign investment can come in, and not realising there's a whole massive array of things that attract an investor. That's only one part of it. So we need to look at a whole variety of other issues to be able to sit here in a year's time and say, great, this has been done and this has been done. So in the last year, we've had the devaluation of the free float. We've had the cutting of the fuel subsidy, but not enough, because the devaluation is greater than the fuel subsidy cut. So there has to be a further fuel subsidy cut, because everyone's being subsidised. There's got to be a further cut in, as I said, in the fuel subsidy. I think food is too sensitive an issue, but although I have to say, I think a priority has to be made to upgrade agriculture to increase production, because with an extra 2 million people a year, you need to increase food production and cut wastage of food, which the World Bank estimates around half of food is wasted. So we need to do a lot of things in Egypt to make it work. But they're all doable, but they need to be done more quickly.
Right. And from there, I take it to you, sir, and we start what we have just did not finish. And yes, the Suez Canal access, but it's not just the Suez Canal access, it's the Suez Canal access, the Golden Triangle, and many other mega projects. But yes,
there are two mega projects that are being criticized actually in a wrong way. The Suez Canal was a strategic decision, and a very wise strategic decision, because basically there were two mega projects that are in the final stages of execution in the region. One is a land-sea route through 3 countries, and one is a canal parallel to the Suez Canal. And both projects were at the final stage. I think the government has acted very quickly and with a lot of alertness, that they figured out that there is risk on this project, which is very important to Egypt, and they had to actually finish the second line, which will, I mean, people will say there was a bottleneck of 6 hours. What 6 hours? It's not the 6 hours. It is the message to the other mega projects that we are perfect now. And competition, when you have the two routes parallel, and one of them is actually depreciated 100 years ago, so it has 0 cost for us, and the other one has costed us 60 billion, which is nothing compared to the size of the project. You are sending a message that we can compete on prices in a very aggressive way. So basically, you can kill the other two projects from a commercial point of view, not from a strategic point of view. I think the government has done something also very wise by not publicizing this, the aim and the objective of the second canal that is because the 3 or 4 countries involved, we have a very strong relationship with. So the government actually kept quiet, very diplomatic, and very wise by not saying we are doing this because other countries, because basically when you say this, you are jeopardizing your relationship with these countries. So the government acted very quickly and very competitive, and actually killed the other 2 projects before they start, and at the same time kept the relationship with these countries very well without saying anything. So I think this, I mean, it's really, when I read it in the newspaper, people, they don't know that there was a huge risk in Egypt if we didn't do this step. And the 2 projects are now idle, but they were going to be executed in 2017. And it's a public knowledge. Everybody knows it in the global markets, except us. Very strange. And we have this very important mega project of us. The other project is the new capital. As my colleague said, how can you compete and attract international companies to go in Mohansin or in Zamalek or in 6th of October when you don't have parking, when the roads are blocked 24/7? When, I mean, you don't have decent office buildings. When, I mean, the capital is actually, there is no way you can bring international companies to operate here versus other countries where the routes are easy and there is offices and there is, I think also, one is the law. The second thing is to provide the infrastructure for the international companies to in Egypt. So also the other project is very important to Egypt, or we will never have international. Even if we change the laws and put extremely favorable laws, there is no infrastructure. So the government is building the infrastructure to attract the international business. So also this project is criticized, and everybody is complaining from the streets. It's very strange.
So I guess when President Sisi said tough Egyptian economic conditions would be improving in 6 months, he meant that.
I think both projects were very, very important to Egypt. I think the people who are criticizing 60 billion or 100 billion pounds, which is actually very trivial amounts compared to the importance of these 2 projects.
If we I get back to you, sir, and you spoke highly of the Suez Canal. But are you speaking about the route, the navigation route, or are you speaking about the industrial zone,
no,
the potentials of such an
industrial... The Suez Canal zone that's being set up. In principle, it's attractive. But again, you've got to look at the attractiveness compared to Jebel Ali in Dubai, or Salalah in Oman, or Tangiers, and they're tax-free. So the issue you've got to, and remember it's still under development, is look for other ways to be attractive. And that could be cost of developing in manufacturing.
What do those other areas, how do we compete other than the taxation issue?
Well, tax is one of the key
yes,
issues.
But other than that, I mean, do those other areas have the same potentials that we really have here?
Yes.
They have?
Yes.
Please, illustrate.
Okay. You look at Jebel Ali, a massive, in Dubai, a massive global hub for people moving in and out and goods going in and out and across the region for re-exporting. Salalah on a perfect route from east to west in Oman.
We're speaking about trade.
Yes, for trade. But then you look at Tangiers, where you have a massive plant, I think it's Nissan and other car companies, big plants in the tax-free zone, which is huge on the edge of Tangier and Morocco. So I think that if the government's, and it is serious about it, what it can do, is you need to be much more business-minded. And I think what I'd like to see is to see more business-minded decisions to see that we have to become even more competitive. So it goes just beyond tax. Because if you actually look at labor costs in Egypt are cheaper compared to the countries I've been mentioning. And it could well be people, that's one reason to be in Egypt. The fact that it has trade agreements with the region and with Africa and with Europe. People think, oh, that's interesting too. Because if you look at China, the costs of doing business in China are rising quite significantly. But you've got to do more than that. So people think, okay, we've got to do more. How do we do it? This is where we want to get. We want to employ many more people in Egypt, and how do we get there? And say, for example, it isn't just that. If you learn from the 1930s, in my economic history from university, there was only one big project in America, the building of the Hoover Dam. Getting people back to work happened all over the country. where people were getting back to work building schools and bridges and roads and other developments across the country. So it had a psychological effect on the population, that there was something happening where they lived. It wasn't just something big and grand somewhere else. And I think I'd like to see some more local programs that would be more than just roads, but would be helping with either improving agricultural yields, improving in the internal market. So you'd have more refrigerated buildings all over the Delta so that produce wouldn't waste by the time it came to the marketplace. Improve the logistics of getting the food to the final marketplace, because around half of all food is spoiled in Egypt by the time it reaches the consumer. If that was cut enormously, the food prices ought to come down. And that has to happen.
But I guess that's also, that is relevant to hear what Mr. Hussam was speaking about, infrastructure, roads.
The opportunities here are great. I mean, I'm here, I'm an investor in Egypt, and I really wanted to work with a passion. But Egypt has to listen more to what's happening in the global marketplace. And I don't think that enough people are really listening to make Egypt even more competitive, because the world is becoming more competitive. There's only so much investment going around the world. People don't, as I said already, don't have to be here. I'd like people to be here and make it work, and it can work, but we need to do much more to make Egypt more attractive, and I hope that happens as we come into this new year, that it happens this year.
Yes, but I guess I may disagree with you this time. No, people listen, and they are listening very hard, particularly those days, to the business-minded people. Yes,
Good.
They are.
I'm one of them. I know I get asked my opinion, which is great, but I'm only one person amongst many. But the fact is that, well, if you look at the decision-making, we need to speed it up, and speed it up, make it more quick. I think that'd be one piece of advice I'd say to the decision-makers. Let's speed it up.
Right. If I get back to you, sir, and yes, Mr. Angus here spoke about what we need to put in those areas that we have created and we're working on, and he's speaking about taxation and also opening to some creative or out of ideas. Yes, that's very good indeed. But if we get back to those areas that we have initiated, and those areas have many potentials, part of the Suez Canal axis is the industrial hub and the logistic hub that is supposed to be an area for services to all this navigation route. Now, how do you evaluate our potentials in this particular area?
I think the potential is great. I mean, we have the location, you have the Suez Canal itself, but I think we are moving very slowly on this regard. I mean, as Angus said, I mean, we need to move very quickly because the other countries are moving very quickly. Yes, so we have to be proactive. We have to go and talk to the investors. We have to actually market ourselves. We are not marketing ourselves. We are expecting the investors will come to Egypt and then they will ask for land. They will ask for some. We are not. Actually, Jabal Ali and the DIFC, the senior people there, they go and market to the international companies. They travel to Japan, they travel to China, they travel and they try to attract the international business from its country of origin. We need to do this, and very quickly.
Yes. If we move on to some of other measures that have been taken and other important visits that have been carried out in order to be able to carry out with different or propagate for Egypt on different scale. If we speak about energy for an instant, we have seen this important visit by the Greek and the Cypriot presidents to Egypt and going on with this gas plans and energy plans. If we go to the Italian Eni projects and we see what has been carried out with. If we also see other important visits to China, for an instance, the Chinese president, the growing relations, particularly the economic one with China, with India, for an instance, I mean here that we have been opening up to the world at large. How important are those visits, and how do you think that this would really create a kind of opening our economic spheres? I
think the issue, and it actually has always been the issue, that that at a certain level, the government is very proactive and they know it, but it doesn't get filtered to the lower levels of the staff. I mean, the president is definitely trying to market Egypt as an international hub, and some of the ministers, they are doing this, they are doing it perfect. But
when it comes to implementation on the ground,
it has always been the case since Sadat's era. Sadat has been doing the same. At the same time, it is not moving fast enough because of the government. The government became too big to be managed, actually. This is, in my opinion, this is the problem that we have created, because we wanted to reduce unemployment, so we hired a lot of people, and all the ministers and all the ministries and all the government bodies, and you have all this stuff and complex relationship between the different departments, which is actually delaying the action. This is the problem. So actually, we need to encourage the middle management to act in the same way the president and the ministers are acting. This is the problem.
Or in the same speed?
Same speed, to be empowered, to be actually relieved from the responsibility, because people here, they are scared of carrying the responsibility of doing something that they will be accused of not, of doing something wrong. All this, culture need to change.
The IMF, and we all know that in November, Egypt has signed a staff-level agreement with the IMF over the upcoming 3 years for $12 billion. I guess the World Bank also, and the African Bank will have another deals with them. The IMF have or has approved such a loan on a reform program that has been submitted by the government. So, how do you view the agreement of the IMF? How do you view the government's plan that was submitted to the IMF? How do you evaluate the whole issue here?
First of all, the plan, the agreement, it's not it was an initial staff level agreement. It's now a formal agreement with IMF, so we've moved on. Now it's been signed.
Yes, it now has been signed, yes, very much, and we even received the first tranche of the, yes.
And then the second tranche will have some conditionality. The key issues, I think, the IMF and other bodies, like the IFC, but particularly the World Bank and the IMF will look at, are the targets for the budget deficit, because Egypt's been running living beyond its means. So it's to ensure that spending is on target, that tax raising is on target, to ensure that the targets that have been set behind the scenes by the government will be met, to ensure that Egypt's on track to get the budget deficit from about 13% or so equivalent of GDP to below 9, to about 9.5, maybe below 10% of GDP in the current fiscal year. It has to do that. And it'd be great to see. That's one issue. The fuel subsidy cut will have to happen. There'll have to be another fuel subsidy cut. It's massively inefficient. I mentioned on your program years ago with your colleague that an average car historically would cost the taxpayer, would be subsidising an average car between 80 and 90 pounds for one journey from Cairo to Alexandria. That is unforgivable wastage of public money that should have been spent on health and education or other elements of infrastructure, rather than subsidising pollution and other costs. So it has to change. In a world that there's much more focus on the environment, it's also unsustainable. So these are key issues that I think the IMF and others will be looking at. But as I mentioned, the budget deficit has to be cut. The government has been spending beyond its means. It's not been raising enough in the marketplace, either through tax or other forms of raising funds. And
I guess that the general budget have been discussing the expenditures of the government, and that has been put into considerations recently. Yes.
But the fact is that the government is serious about it. The president and the government are very serious.
We don't have any luxurious
there is, but there isn't also, there's no option. The government
has
significant funding of over $20 billion in the next fiscal year. That money's got to come from somewhere. Historically, it came from the Gulf. That help that came with very generous help. And now Egypt will need to find other ways to raise it. We'll look maybe bond issuance in the first quarter of 2017 would raise a few $1 billion. That would help. The IMF finance would go some way to another $1 billion from the World Bank. would also help. The $500 million from the African Development Bank will help, but you still leave a significant funding gap. So that has to be looked at as to where that money will come from. So it's imperative, as we're both saying, there needs to be a much greater speeding up of this whole program of reform, of privatization, of privatizing the state banks, of privatizing other assets, of packaging government assets and making them more efficient.
Yes. I guess we'll have to end our discussion for today because my time is out here. And I guess, yes, you gave many recommendations that have to be looked for during the year 2016. We've been trying to put the economy on track. I guess we have hard work to do yet.
And we're both optimistic. Let's say we're saying we're optimistic. We're not negative, we're optimistic, and we want it to work. And we're both full of ideas, and other people are full of ideas to make this happen.
So let's just leave it with optimism, right?
Sure.
Many thanks for you, Mr. Hassam Raouf, ex-head of the International Bank. Thank you very much for being with us. Mr. Angus Blair, International Investment Banker. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
The viewers, I guess now we leave you with a recap to the economic situation and the stock market during this week. But before we go, let me just say Happy New Year for all people around the globe. Many thanks for watching.
The non-petroleum exports of Egypt have increased by 7.6% during the 11-month period from January until November 2016. General Authority for Export and Import Control said Egypt non-petroleum exports recorded $17.35 billion during this period. The country's exports of construction materials recorded $4.408 billion, while exports of chemicals and fertilizers surged to $2.95 billion. The Egyptian exchange EGX gained nearly 76.2% or 5,339 points during 2016 to close at 12,344.89 points, recording its all-time high. Egypt's worst gains in 2016 followed the recent decision made by the Central Bank of Egypt to liberalize the Egyptian pound against the US dollar. The market witnessed 57.4 million shares changed hands worth 152.7 billion Egyptian pounds. The Egyptian Minister of Planning, Monitoring and Administrative Reform said that the ministry is planning to re-evaluate its targets for the growth of the economy in the current fiscal year after recent reforms. Ashraf Al-Arabi said on the sidelines of a seminar organized by Ittisal that the financial and economic implications of the decision to liberalize the local currency and to raise interest rates on the state budget are currently being studied. Earlier, Egypt announced that it's targeting a growth rate of 5.2% this fiscal year compared to around 4.3% in the previous year. The Central Bank of Egypt decided to maintain interest rates unchanged during its latest Monetary Policy Committee meeting. CBE kept the overnight deposit rate at 14.75% and the overnight lending rate at 15.75%. On the 3rd of November, the CBE took financial markets by surprise by raising its policy rates by 300 basis points as part of a liberalization of its foreign exchange market. Egypt witnessed foreign direct investments of more than $1 billion by the first 2 weeks following the liberalization of the Egyptian pound against the US dollar. Minister of Finance Amr El-Garhi said most of the international credit agencies have amended their evaluation for the Egyptian economy as well as their economic outlook. Egypt's flow of foreign direct investments surged 7%. That is equivalent to $458.4 million during the fiscal year 2015-2016. People in India had until Friday to deposit discontinued notes in bank and post office accounts or risk their money becoming worthless. Early last month, the government scrapped the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes to crack down on undeclared money and fake cash. The move divided opinion, especially over how the ban was implemented. Parliament is preparing laws that will make it a criminal offense to hold the old notes from the 1st of April 2017 onwards. Oil prices were down but were still on track for their biggest annual gain since 2009 after OPEC and other major producers agreed to cut output to reduce a global supply overhang that has depressed prices for 2 years. U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate WTI crude futures were down 25 cents at $53.52 a barrel, while Brent fell 26 cents to 56.59 a barrel. Brent has risen about 50% this year and WTI has climbed around 43%, the largest annual gains since the year 2009 when Brent and WTI rose 78% and 71% respectively. House price growth was relatively stable in 2016 but is likely to slow next year. According to its latest house price index, average prices have grown by 4.5% over the last 12 months, the same rate in 2015. However, it believes the UK will see modestly slower increases next year as the economy weakens. The Building Society said house price growth of around 2% was more likely than a decline. China is the world's second largest economy and has one of the fastest growth rates of any G20 nation, but its stock markets have been among the worst performing in the world this year. The benchmark Shanghai Composite Index SCI struggled towards the finish line Thursday, down 12.5% for the year, compared to falls of 0.6% by the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong and 2.2% for Japan Nikkei 300. Both markets are trading Friday. It had the worst showing among the 40-plus countries tracked by Wall Street Journal's Market Data Center, behind even that ridden Portugal. U.S. economy grew even faster than thought in the July to September period. The world's largest economy grew at an annualized rate of 3.5% in the quarter, up from an earlier estimate of 3.2%. It was the second time that the figure had been revised upwards from an initial 2.9%. The rate of growth in the third quarter was the strongest for 2 years. Tracking a firm global trend and continued buying by local jewelers, gold maintained its upward trend for the fourth day on the trot and added another 150 at 28,500 per 10 grams on Friday. But silver went steady at 39,900 per kilogram on scattered support from industrial units. Traders said that apart from the bullish trend overseas and weakness in the dollar that stoked demand for the precious metal as a safe haven asset, persistent buying by local jewelers boosted gold prices. A controversial proposal to tax all goods and services coming into the United States has a better chance of becoming law than many on Wall Street suspect. The so-called border-adjusted tax is part of the House tax overall plan that also would reduce the corporate from 35% to 20%. The idea is to tax goods as they come into the country from overseas, but to avoid taxing U.S. exports at all. For instance, a car imported into the U.S. from Mexico would be taxed, but the American-made steel sent to Mexico would not.